5 things within this speech. First, I'm going to explain when exactly do you apply these disincentives. Second, why do companies not comply in the status quo? Why is there a need to apply these disincentives? Thirdly, what are the harms of non-compliance that occur onto consumers and workers? Fourthly, why is this effective as a mechanism? Fifthly and lastly, what do government demands for these look like? First, when exactly do you apply these disincentives? We think these are threefold. First, cases of non-compliance with safety standards, etc., that already exist or have been existing within the legal purview for a long period of time already, which means that these are laws that you have known already always existed and you just didn't care enough to go ahead and comply with these laws. But secondly, we think in case of negligence as well. So in case there are certain safety standards or there are certain licensing protocols that you have to follow on a regular basis, and something like that is not being followed. An intuition like this is just simply certain products are banned on these like online sites like Blinkit, etc. So if certain type of cigarettes are banned and you're selling those cigarettes, that's like gross negligence, and it's important to go ahead and curb that. But thirdly, we think that non-compliance with latest laws also becomes a reason for you to apply these disincentives, because essentially this is a growing space in most developing countries, and the legal status that most things are given under these countries is also evolving. We think insofar as this is an evolving sphere, it's very important for you to ensure that companies comply with the latest laws as soon as possible. This mechanism becomes a very easy way of ensuring that this compliance happens in the best and the fastest way possible. Secondly, why do companies not comply with the status quo? Three reasons under this. I think first, we have profit incentives for these companies, because saving costs becomes one of the major ways in which they increase their profits, because non-compliance to standards is a very easy way for you to go ahead and pump up your profits by saving the cost. So in case I'm not paying sanitation workers within most stores enough, I can save cost there. In case I'm not giving enough commissions, I can save cost there. This just tells you why companies do this firstly. But secondly, we think there's also consumer satisfaction, because these companies promise convenience to people. So they promise certain delivery times that, oh hey, you'll have this order within your home or on your doorstep by the next 10 minutes, and that is why they pressure the workers to go ahead and work under extreme time crunch situations. So because of this promise of convenience, it becomes another reason for companies to not comply with the latest laws against this sort of time crunch situations. But thirdly, we think these people just have no capacity to unionize, so the workers within these companies cannot unionize usually because of two simple reasons. One, these are probably very poor people in developing countries who are earning the lowest of wages and are just not aware of the kind of rights they can exercise. But secondly, and more importantly, these people work for many different like delivery platforms. So I can work for Zepto, Blinkit, Zomato, etc. The problem arises that trade unions work on a simple principle of loyalty. So if I work for you and you only, that's when I can go ahead and unionize under your company's umbrella. But when I'm working for so many other companies, unionization becomes difficult. This gives you three reasons why companies don't comply with standards, or why they can get away with it. But thirdly, what do government demands look like within this, and exactly what do you not do when you start this disincentives? First, we think you have strict regulations about sanitation of course. So you as the government conduct regular checks about sanitation. In case you note that hey, certain standards are not being met, that is when you go ahead and apply this disincentives on the company. Second, we think increase in commission. So you apply certain things like, hey, this is a minimum. So from a 2 to 3% commission, you probably say now you have to give a 4 to 5% commission to your workers. When you don't go ahead and do that, this is probably the point in time. Government applies disincentives. But thirdly, you also vouch for relaxed delivery times and probably bring about laws. So this is important because this again evades the time crunch situation. But fourthly and lastly, we think you constantly bring in new laws about giving these people insurance, etc. Companies don't comply with these laws as soon as they're out, because they feel like you can just delay this process as much as we can. We think government demands look like you complying with this as soon as these laws come out, or you go ahead and put disincentives on you. Before I go on to what are the extreme harms of non-compliance?
Sure, there are already things like labor laws and safety standards, which means that if companies break them, we already have to punish them, which means that this debate is only about, as the motion states, depends on low wage gig employment. You only do this so that you're forcing companies to increase like the wages they get. It's only about that.
No, I think you can give disincentives for a bunch of reasons, and that remains. But we have already included the reason that they've given within our purview of the characterization for it. What are the extreme harms of non-compliance? We think first these are vulnerable workers for two key reasons. They are poor, they are earning the lowest of wages. An average worker working for Blinkit or Zomato or Zepto earns like $10 a day after working for 13 to 14 hours. We think this is extremely hard, tiring, and like a job where you have to do extreme amounts of hard work and you earn like literally peanuts on the job, which means that these are for the most part vulnerable workers. But secondly, we think we have already told you why they can't unionize, which just pushes more on the vulnerability factor. So even if their case is going to be that these companies are vulnerable and you can't just ask these companies to give more wages, we think these workers are far more vulnerable as stakeholders. But secondly, we think that these workers get pushed into extreme race against time situations where they often get into accidents. If you look at the data available from in the last 5 years since Blinkit and Zepto have come up, you will see that the amount of accidents that these people have to go through and the lack of support that these people get as a result of getting into those accidents is actually shocking. These people don't get any help from these companies. The insurance is negligible. There is no medical coverage for these people because we are not seen as workers. They are seen as contractual labor, which means that at all points of time you get into accidents because the company wants to give convenience to some privileged consumers, but you never really go ahead and get the sort of medical respite that these companies should have given you because you were their workers. Lastly, we think why will this not harm companies and why will companies stay? I think the vein here is pretty simple. We think that we are okay with, instead of 10 companies existing, just 2 or 3 existing, but these 2 or 3 existing will be the companies that comply with the entirety of government laws and restrictions. The reason, the intuition pump for this is simple. There are some companies who think that it is more expensive to fail than to not comply. In which case, they think it's okay to go ahead and evade the disincentives that government is giving you, to just go ahead and comply with whatever the government is saying and go ahead and give your workers what they need. And the thing is, there is internal competition within these companies as well. So the reason why these companies want to do this is because when you do this, you can get favors from the government. So you can say that, hey, we were the only company who sort of went ahead and were the first to comply with all your restrictions and all your new laws, which means that I think we deserve some subsidies, I think we deserve some tax cuts. And the government is likely to give this because they want to create an atmosphere where there is not a monopoly and there is many different companies operating, which is why they incentivize you to go ahead and apply. Jyotsna, can we keep this one here for time?
That by companies right now pays like good amount of money to these people that they can survive. The first reason they themselves, there is competition. I.e., if there are 2 or 3 type of companies and there are 10 million workers, and if you know that other companies paying a lot more, these workers can oftentimes leave because as they themselves said that they are not under contract, so it is oftentimes also easier to opt out. Hence, companies also have to compete to hire people and give them some sort of more incentive in the first place. But second, I want to note that this debate cannot be about minimal wages or minimal safety. Oftentimes, political parties do have an incentive to target and help these people. Because if company does something that harms people or kills them, it oftentimes comes down to political parties and backlash. Hence, the minimum wage laws, even within the developing countries and safety compliance exist, and with time they are increasing a lot more. Because people are aware about this. So if one accident happens, it forces government and people to be aware and also some accountability in the future. Second, on working union, and here I want to challenge the intuition that these people cannot challenge. I would note that it is easier to challenge these companies because there is only one company you have to target. I.e., within the Zomato, there are 10,000 drivers who are operating in, and if the wages are too low, if accidents are happening every day, even if 5,000 drivers say that we will not drive for 1 week, oftentimes Zomato have to suffer millions of dollars of loss within that time. I would note that if driver does not drive for 5 days, it does not affect them that much. But if significant amount of drivers of one company does not drive for 5 or 6 days, companies oftentimes have to suffer millions of losses which they cannot complete. This also happened in India where Blinkit drivers oftentimes went on strike. So it is easier for people, but also it is incentive of drivers because they know that they don't want to die. Oftentimes drivers think that if I die, I cannot provide for my family, and they also have an incentive. But second, I would note that even if you work for different companies, you still have an incentive to unionize because it is not like you cannot unionize if you are working for 2 companies. If you are a driver and if you know that if you are unionized and collectivized, it will help you in future. So it is incentive to drivers to comply with each other, coordinate with each other going forward. But last last time, these companies oftentimes care about their public image a lot more. I.e., if driver dies under a uniform, or oftentimes there is a media backlash within these companies, and oftentimes they also have to suffer within the laws. But last thing I want to note that oftentimes lawyers and public IPOs fire against this type of companies because they know that they earn millions amount of money. I.e., this is the reason why Blinkit and Zomato have to pay significant amount of money to lawyers, and oftentimes they fear this. But lastly, I want to prove that all of these things are going to increase with time and people become aware and aware. So this proves that by even on outside the house, drivers earn some money, they are under a minimal safety guidance, and then ask for more in future. We proved that by on this of the house, the companies don't scale up and hence not producing net amount of more job. The first burden which I want to push them, that it is not certain that by these companies will increase the wages of this driver. And here I want to do simple mathematical intuition. If there are 50 million drivers under Blinkit in India, and you have to increase 500 or 200 wages, that means that you have to increase 200 multiplied to 20 million. The amount is so much more. We would rather pay taxation or revenue cut to government and not increase, because in the end we are still earning a net profit instead of increasing the wages of 10 to 50 million in the first place. So let's say that even if you increase the wages, what does that mean? That you have net profit loss within this company. And I want to characterize that what does this company look like. Panel, these companies oftentimes run in net loss in 5 to 10 periods. There's significant reason for this. Oftentimes when these companies start to operate, they have to charge by a minimum amount of price to the product. So if a product in offline setting charge of $20, you have to sell it to $15. That is the reason why people will buy it in the first place. So this proved that oftentimes these companies initially have to operate in net losses. So even if Uber Eats is stopped to act right now, they're still not earning the net profit, the amount they have put within this company. But second, there is a significant amount of pressure from investors. You also have to satisfy your investors. You also have to give them the profit cut. And as the time goes on after 5 and 10 years, the pressure of these investors starts to rise down. So in their best case, even if they have to pay millions of drivers of 500 or 600 rupees more, that means that you have net profit. What does this mean? First, you are not able to scale up and form the new factories because you have to, there is a net, oftentimes this profit is used to scale up within the first place, so you can minimize the net loss. Second thing is that oftentimes this also leads to things like investor pullout. So if you know that you are not going to get the profit you were charged before, oftentimes they say that, oh, we will not support you more, we will not fund you more. What does this mean? That there are no new factories, there are new scale up, and there are no new jobs. The second thing which I want to prove is that by also affect new startup and new news within the delivery setting. The first thing I would know that new startup and new news things like medical services. So there is a medical service that will give you medicine in 10 minutes to 15 minutes. Things like services like Twinks or other things or not. Other needs are starting to rise up. Those companies know that they can do this. But the problem is that this startup oftentimes do not have highest amount of budgets. They run on very tight budget as possible. But second there also is investor scrutiny. It means that you are very careful that whether you want to invest in these companies or not, that how much profit you are able to run. If this is true, and then they have to pay the workers a lot more than they are paying right now, that just means that you have less and less investors going in. But second, this is also signaling effect for foreign FDRs or foreign investors. Oftentimes you do not want to come to countries where there are tight regulations from government. Hence you would prioritize the countries where you can scale up a lot more easier and you can earn a lot more profit. That means that new startup and new niches are not able to come, hence the new jobs also are not able to come. I want to do way in terms of why these new jobs are better than increased wages, but for that I just want to visualize the number of jobs. Oftentimes, these jobs increase a lot more. So if you open a new factory to store your warehouse, you have to hire cashier. You have to hire 3 or 4, 5 people to take care of this thing or to maintain midnight. Then you have to hire 5 more drivers to do this type of things. This means that even if you open one factory, you oftentimes end up benefit. Oh, I'm so sorry. In the end, you will end up benefit like 20 to 30 people even if you open one factory. But it is that new jobs are more important. First, oftentimes people in the developing countries are unemployed, but also they do not have education to go to things like doctor, engineering. So this is the only ways they can earn money. But second, if you go to, so even if you do not go to this job like Blinkit, then you have to do so unofficial job. Then you have to work in local factory. I would know that working conditions in these local factories are a lot more harmful, so you cannot calculate this specific speaker. Your capacity to ask for wages is also very low. But secondly, to note that possibility of life is more important than slightly better quality of life. So even if I'm earning 2,000, I can still do a lot more things. But a person who is unemployed at home, they do not have any life. It is not our doubt that these people are earning a lot more, earning some money than not money than anything. But second, you can improve your quality of life a lot better. So even if I work in a Blinkit or Uber Eats for 1 year and I'm earning minimum, at least I'm earning some money and I can use this money to increase and scale or get some skill. But unemployed man cannot do that because he does not have money. We proved that by the net job increase is good thing for people. It's good because I would know that not unemployed is a lot better than unemployed.
For far too long has Om Prakash from Blinkit suffered under the injustices of a corporate structure that is built against him. There are three things that will come in this speech. Number one, the state has a reparative obligation towards these workers who have suffered injustices that are far beyond their comprehension or beyond their control. Number one, the state hasn't been able to uplift these individuals out of the trenches of poverty and the demonic hands of corporations who build laws and structures that are actively built to work against them. In which case, they lack alternatives or they lack the ability to get meaningful education or to bypass things like casteism or religious indoctrination that these people cannot meaningfully bypass because the state already actively enforces it as well in the majority of developing states where populist politics happens in most instances for their own incentives. In which case these people suffer far more independent of the work that they do. But this magnifies way more when these people start working in these institutions and these organizations because it actively shows the kind of treatment that they get. They get mistreated in workplaces, they get mistreated by consumers to whom they deliver pieces of bread and all of those things. They are working for the convenience of a rich privileged fuck who can't walk 100 meters for a pack of bread. They have to skip traffic lights, they have to drive that bike for 50 kilometers per hour. They have to risk getting hit by a truck and losing their life and making their children orphans. But they also have to continuously work in unsanitated ghost stores where presumably the majority of products are eaten by rats, in which case consumers also get harmed as a consequence because they do not get access to quality products because these companies just could not give less of a shit. In which case I want to respond to their material now. The first thing that they say at Bhavisya is to explain that there are existing labor laws. I would posit that these labor laws are just innately weak. There are three very broad reasons for this. Number one, the gig economy right now is a new economy that has come up and it is going through rapid development process. Uber Eats did not exist for 10 or 15 years ago. These are new regulations that are not as standardized and formalized on a global stage or gets enough recognition for countries or economic policies to be centered around them. But number two, people do not care as much because Aaryan already explains who are the people who work in these big economies or in these companies. The workers who drive those bikes have very less savings. These are people from lower castes, presumably like what happens in India's caste system. But there are also people who are disenfranchised and underprivileged. In which case, these people just do not have a fucking voice. Consumers do not care about them as much. How many times have any of you given a glass of water to a Blinkit delivery partner or Zomato delivery partner that has come to your home to deliver the food that you ordered? These are the kinds of injustices that these people actively go through on a daily basis. Sit down, calm down. In which case, these people suffer the most harm and they do not have the ability to voice out. Which is why politicians do not care about them as much. Even if they do, it is momentary. Which is what happened with Raghav Chadha in India recently for Blinkit and Zomato delivery drivers. What happened? For 1 week, there was discussion in the parliament. The next week, they were talking about Vande Mataram and every other bullshit that is not relevant to the most vulnerable populations. In those instances, these people suffer injustices. In which case, the state has to meaningfully intervene right now because they owe a reparative obligation to the most vulnerable people who opt into this job because they fall into the demonic marketing that these companies do, which is that you do not need to go anywhere else. We are a new industry. This is a first mover advantage. This is where you get the most money. This is the easiest thing to do. You drive a bike. Now you have to drive a bike for a living and it's easy as fuck. But you know what happens with them? What happens is that they have to drive for 12 hours a day. They have to drive for 13 hours a day. Why? Because they make 30 cents off of an order value of $5 because of very low margins on every order value, in which case they have to scale their profits by taking as many orders as they possibly can, which is why they have to comply with the standards that these companies set for them. They have to work for promotional incentives and to work for bonuses that they might just not even get if these companies don't care as much. Which is why, as a consequence of these regulations being meaningfully weak or antitrust in most developing states being excessively slow and very weak because of not enough policy support or popular support, because this does not become a voter issue in the most vast instances because people do not care as much and politicians have other things for people to care about, in which case they make other things a voter issue like religion in the most developing countries. This is the context that Elo misses, which is why they will lose. What happens beyond this? There are three unique things that happen. Number one, workers are fucked because they get mistreated. Number two, they have to take risks on their lives for jobs that they otherwise would not have to do, in which case they could go to literally anywhere else, which is the comparative that they try to push. That these workers, if they lose jobs in Blinkit, they have to go to worse places. I would note that these skills can be transferable, in which case even if they do non-meaningful jobs on other industries, those meaningful industries are way more regulated and have way more stronger labor unions in most instances, which is why they can get way more protection on the comparative as opposed to these companies who do not care about those regulations as much. Which is why these compliance rules and laws are the most important thing within the round, because it does three unique things. Before I go on, Bhavisya.
So if these regulations are good enough, then other companies who comply which are much smaller, so why are bigger companies won't comply?
Regulations differ for different industries. You can't say there is a blanket policy for literally every single industry. Different industries have different compliance standards, but different production processes and manufacturing processes that they go through. They have different instances with their different types of supply chains which require different nationalities from them. In which case, this industry is rather underdeveloped. There is a need for these regulations to develop. This is the first step that we take from side proposition. Number one, what this does uniquely. Sit down, I've taken one. In which case, the first thing that it does is becomes a vast instance of investor signaling for the vast majority of these companies who care about those investors, because they work on the instance of angel investors or tier funding that they get, because these companies don't immediately go IPO or get public funding. In which case, they rely on these investors. When these investors pull out because these companies do not comply, I will buy the trade-off. Even if some companies just end up fucking failing, it is fine. Why? Because of two reasons. Number one, the market share that these companies now leave is available for other companies who comply with those standards to capture. In which case, they capture the supply chains, they capture the demand that is there in those regions in which they have an incentive to expand if they are compliant, because if you comply, then it gives you incentives instead of disincentives as on the comparative. In which case you expand, but also you obviously when you expand you need more laborers and workers. In which case you absorb the workers that the failed company leaves. In which case these people retain their jobs in most cases, because you can't create jobs out of nowhere. In which case these people who already have meaningful experience working for a similar company, they presumably get that job elsewhere in a company that survives these regulations. Which explains that as a consequence of this, even if it leads to a filtering process, I would note that these big companies surviving even if monopoly is the case that they want to run is a benefit that I will explain. In which case, these big companies have way more visibility for regulation and compliance standards as opposed to startups who people don't care about as much, because lawsuits often go unnoticed, protests often go unnoticed for the vast majority of people. But when there is a short value created by a company like Zomato, Blinkit or Uber, this is where people actually get the visibility that is required, because these are tech giants who people meaningfully consume content of. In which case, this explains why there is more visibility for these bigger companies in instances where they don't comply. This also translates to investors caring about those things, because they lose the demand and the consumer market, because investors think long term for a new industry or a new company in a newer or a budding industry. In which case they care for long term compliance standards and long term profits that these investors can derive. In which case they push their companies to comply with those standards. This is the incentive and the incentive structure that uniquely unlocks the consequence of this. For all of those reasons, vote wrong.
Problems with government. The first problem is that government incentives on either side are same. So if they say that government incentivized to probably expand these companies, the incentive is same. They don't actually have fucking incentives. But second problem then is that some laws are just common across all industries. I mean, minimum wage is something that's common across all industries, regardless of where you are. But third problem, the missing point on their side is they are never able to prioritize between a person who don't get a job and a person who already has a job and has a shitty life. This is the missing burden on their side, and we posit that the people who don't even have a job or who don't even have the option to opt into these companies are much more vulnerable. But even if that's not true, I'm still going to prove why they're still better. The first thing I want to prove then is why loss is massive in these companies and they are just not big tech giants, etc. 4 reasons. One, oftentimes for quick deliveries, they have to have warehouses every 4 kilometers, every 2 kilometers, every 5 kilometers. This is massive fixed cost that they need to put in. But second, there's some initial resistance among consumers. I mean, my mom still says that don't order from Blinkit, they give you bad vegetables, etc., etc. So there's some initial resistance among consumers, and this is what Bhavisya tells you. To cope up with this initial resistance, you need to have loss-making strategies and seeping-in strategies where you have to providing products on subsidies, etc., etc. But thirdly then, there's a problem in learning curves, right? Which means that since these industries are new, they don't have a lot of ways to produce cheaper products, so they don't know how to they don't know how to minimize the cost of production, etc., etc. Because they haven't been existing for a long period of time. When they exist for a long period of time, they have the learning curve, etc. But fourthly then, since they're just new companies, they don't have economies of scale, so they're just the laws that they take is massive. The laws that they take is really massive. The second thing I'm going to do then later. The second thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to prove to you why there's a problem in hindering scaling up, etc., etc. First, investors often don't invest. There are 3 specific reasons. One, DCF valuation of these people, DCF valuation of these particular institutional investors, all these investors prioritize instant returns or immediate cash flows, etc. This is just how time value of money works, right? Which means at all points, DCF valuation is something that they rely on to invest in these companies, and if DCF valuation doesn't show good valuation, they probably don't invest. But secondly then, oftentimes the corporate culture is really fun. They produce quarterly reports, right? It's not yearly reports. So oftentimes when these investors see quarterly reports producing losses, they are just disincentivized to invest in these companies. But thirdly then, there's lack of scaling capacity on their side because they probably make massive losses if these companies are growth companies which are still expanding. Investors necessarily want growth. They want capacity to scale up. If they don't show capacity to scale up and they can't even show stability because these are new companies, investors don't want to invest there. But fourthly and lastly, oftentimes these institutional investors have HFT, so even if they are very, very smart, these algorithms are not. These algorithms are built on short-term incentives. These are built on immediate returns, etc., etc. So oftentimes, when these institutional investors invest in these growth companies through HFTs, these HFTs just trade within seconds because they are showing losses over 3 quarters, 2 quarters, etc., etc. But the second problem then is that there are higher interest rates on loans for these companies already because these are startups, these are growing, etc., etc. Which means that at all point they can't even get a lot of loan because on their side the law later. The loss is massive, which means banks are more disincentivized to give loans on their side and they just can't scale up. Third, oftentimes competitors who are really, really big, who can divert to these particular industries, probably divert, and these competitors probably monopolize on these licenses, monopolize on these things, so startups in general can't come up, and you already can see that there are few companies. It is pathetic to view by. Fourthly then, oftentimes you increase consumer prices, which means you decrease opt-ins, you don't even have enough profit to probably invest into your own company, etc. later. Lastly then, you have lesser profit for all the reasons I've proved to you, which means there are lesser retained earnings, but also exactly what Bhavisya says. Now you don't expand into Medicaid, you don't expand into medicine, providing medicines, etc., etc. And I posit that these are the most vulnerable people who immediately need medicines, etc. Cool. What are the impacts of this? First is monopoly or oligopoly. I mean, I don't need to prove it because they can concede to it. What are the harms of it? 3 things there. 1, workers often are fucked because they don't have a lot of options, so there are only two companies, only one company, so I need to consistently get fucked. Second, oftentimes these companies become so large that they have massive lobbying power. 2 reasons within this. 1, oftentimes government are more biased towards these large companies because these large companies have a higher leverage within the government economy. Oftentimes, people just vote on the basis of stability and economy. So oftentimes, these large companies are prioritized by this government in the first place. Second, oftentimes they just meet with these CEOs. Oh my God, you're 19-year-old, you open Zepto, etc., etc. So they meet with these people, they sit with these people. They often have more data points into what problems they're facing, etc., etc. So they're more they're more biased towards these particular owners. Third, oftentimes you increase prices for consumers, and we believe it's pathetic because oftentimes people who want medicines immediately because my son at home is sick, I can't order it. We believe on very, very urgent occasion it is really, really bad for these prices to get increased. But secondly then, oftentimes you fire many workers because we believe that is much easier for you to do instead of cutting down warehouses, etc., etc. There are a couple of harms of this.
This team is confused. They say investors want companies to scale. I agree. But those companies can scale when they cut costs and increase profit margins.
Yeah, I get it. So the problem is this. So when you scale up, you give opportunities to more people. We believe that is better because, okay, I'm going to prove it later. But the first thing then is that you fire many workers on their side. There are 3 specific reasons. One, you want to give lesser people, you want to maximize the amount of incentives and lesser people available to fire many workers. There are 3 specific problems with this. 1, on our side there are more people to be better, right? So it's just better. But second, there's a collectivization problem. If there are lesser people, you just can't collectivize, unions have lesser power, etc. Thirdly, you are not able to scale up into tier 2, tier 3 cities, rural areas because you don't have the money to do this. Why is it the most important thing within this debate? Because oftentimes you can't prioritize between a vulnerable person who don't have a job and a vulnerable person who does have a job. Therefore, it's not the right metric to judge this debate. The right metric to judge this debate is the scale of impact. So probably the worker who doesn't have a job, who's in a tier 2 city, who can't opt into these jobs, is also vulnerable. A person who's having a pathetic life in these particular corporations are also vulnerable. How the fuck do you judge this debate? You judge on the scale of impact, the number of people impact, etc., etc. But lastly, even if they're comparative like these people often you just don't scale up, it's still bad because people in these tier 3 cities go into unofficial factories, etc. Why is it bad? Why is it bad? 3 reasons. 1, these companies have lesser people like employed in general, so they have lesser collectivization power. But second, the government scrutiny on these factories is very, very less because these are diversified, these are decentralized, these are very, very small factories you can't probably do a lot about. But thirdly, then there are not sophisticated companies. These are small factories, they don't have a lot of safety equipment. In general, they have very less safety equipment and very less sanitation than these large companies.
The first thing I want to explain is why do we already independently went on the principle of reparative obligation. Because regardless of any benefits actually reaching these workers or not, we think that the state owes an obligation to ensure that their lives are at least made better in some way possible. Which means that even if some companies pull out and even if on scale we have lesser workers, if each worker lives a better life because now they're getting the adequate wages for the work that they're putting in and they're paid by the adequate wage and given benefits that they're not given otherwise, they're able to reinvest this into making their life better, making life of their children better, making their communities better by giving money to their church, etc. These are all benefits that only unlock insofar as companies comply with better regulations, and this is how our principle is unlocked. Because we explain that the state owes an obligation to ensure that they live better lives. If these people live worse lives, it's a double jeopardy on them. We think that's far worse. The first thing I want to explain is why are companies better or worse, and this will explain the comparative well. We give you a bunch of reasons down the benches for why they don't comply right now. Sit down. There are 4 reasons for this. The first is that there is no contracts in the status quo, which is that if workers are working in 10 different companies don't have an incentive to give them the best wage. Secondly, these companies collude together, which means that they say that they are constantly competing against each other for giving the best wages that they can. But if it is true that one, they are loss making, but two, that giving them higher wages would worsen the losses that they have an incentive to collude together and ensure that they are not giving the best wages possible. This is why there is a minimum rate to which they go. This is lower than the minimum wage that people earn on a daily. Let me just visualize how this looks like right now. If you travel 10 kilometers on a bike, you have to pay for the fuel cost for that the bike insures. You have to pay for the medical bill if you get into an accident. You have to ensure that you're not able to upskill yourself because you're at that job for 10 to 14 hours a day. These are all harms that happen to you. What do you get in return? You get a 5% commission on a 50 rupee delivery that you do. That's 5 rupees that you get. What can you buy for 5 rupees? Intuitively ask yourself. This is empirically true. Just go and watch Raghav Chadda's video, the person that they mentioned. This is literally what happens in the status quo. You cannot counter assert with the reasons why they would give their wages. They don't fucking give them wages in the status quo. Thirdly, we think that these companies think that they can get away with it in the status quo. So even if some fines exist right now, companies think that it's okay to pay these fines right now. Bhavisya is right. They'd rather pay the fines. When? Right now. The government has an incentive to ensure that the taxes that they collect from these companies are higher. They increase the compliance fees that they collect to a higher level. This looks like taking 4 crore, 5 crore, 6 crore. This is the amount of money that you take from these companies when they don't comply. Bhavisya is hearing because he thinks are cases that these companies will often have to pay these fines. That is not our case. Our case is that it shows a signaling effect that forces companies to change their practices rather than continuing to pay these fines. This is why our case hinged on giving better wages to workers because that ensures that they don't have to constantly pay these fines to the government in the status quo. Cool. Fourth reason for this is just that in the status quo, they control the narratives that happens. This is why in the status quo, even if for 7 days you protest against these companies, there's nothing that changes against them. Why do we think that the comparative is far better? Why do we get more compliance when there's fewer companies? We gave you 4 reasons for this. The first is that these companies that now come up have better practices that they have to adopt within themselves if they want to remain competitive. Which is a USP that now Blinkit has over Zepto against dealing with the government is that they're complying by your rules. Look at them, they don't comply by your rules. This incentivizes the government to push towards these companies as the winners of the market because they comply by the rules that they've imposed onto them. This is why these companies, one, don't make the losses that they would have made otherwise, but two, are better incentivized to improve their practices because now they get benefits in return for this that they do not get otherwise. Secondly, it's easier to unionize against these companies when you have contracts that you're working for. When it's just one company, not on their side of the house, your demand against Zomato varies from your demand against Blinkit, based from your demand against Rapido, based from your demand against Ola. There's no unionization that's possible because demands vary across different companies under which you work. Sure. This changes on our side when it's one company, when you know what are the exact problems that exist, when that company's supply chains are fucked, when you don't go to work for them.
These are the harms that happen when workers are able to unionize against one company on our side or two companies on our side. Thirdly, investor pullout does not happen, and there are a lot of reasons for this. Investors don't give a fuck about profit or loss in the short term. This is why Uber had investors for a long time, even though made a loss for 7 years. This is why Amazon became profitable after 15 years. The reason for this is that these companies care about valuation, and shareholders care about valuation because they want to sell this at a high valuation. Why does this matter? Because you get valuation out of expanding more. This is the incentive that investors have to ensure that expansion continues to happen. This is symmetric in nature, which is that they cannot just claim that they get more expansion on their side because this incentive never goes out on our side of the house. This is why Blinkit and Zomato have been able to constantly expand, even though they are already making losses in the status quo. But thirdly, if there's sufficient demand for the services that they're talking about, this happens anyways. Because demand is met by suppliers. Because suppliers care about making whatever profit that they can from whatever demand that exists. If there's demand for medical services, this will be met anyways by the investment that comes from these companies. At the end of this, what we proven is that companies have far better incentive to be good while they're far more efficient. Yeah.
Zomato as of now hire 3.5 million drivers. How many wage per driver you think you will increase?
So we'll increase probably 3 to 5%. That's what we told. But even if they don't increase, one, we can ensure that they might get better insurances. But third, we just increase the amount of delivery time. Instead of it being 10 minutes, it's now 20 minutes or 25 minutes. We don't care about the 10% consumers who lose out on convenience when 90% people can now save their lives by not getting into accidents that they're forced into by the companies that they work at. So even if wages never increase, this still gets better. Companies are far more efficient. One, they're able to negotiate at scale with wholesale stores. This is why these are better. They get things like cheaper prices, they cost subsidized. Secondly, they have better supply chains that they can access. These are maintained in the long term. But thirdly, they have the best algorithms, so these companies are better. Do we want more jobs or better jobs? We told you there are a lot of reasons why new jobs don't come up on their side of the house. The first is that this is zero sum. If there are laborers in the market and there's demand in the market, they'll be hired by anyone. So if Zepto wants laborers because it wants to sell sanitary pads to women in a specific city, these laborers will come up anyways and they'll be hired anyways because that demand exists, which is why you have an incentive to ensure that the supply increases on either side. Secondly, political will exists on either side of the house to increase the amount of jobs that are coming in. People don't want to sit on their asses unemployed, not having any money. You see, even if you lose jobs on our side of the house, the government incentivizes companies to hire these people and gives them incentives for this. This is why the competitor is far better than whatever we get on their side.
Two responses to laws. They say these are new things. These are not, they have existed for 5-6 years, and we tell you that over time they're obviously going to get better. Second, they say people don't care. This is just so funny that they go ahead and literally give you the names of people who have died, like Raghav Chadha and all, and then say people don't care. Presumably it is precisely because people care so much that these things are so visible in social media that they're literally using this as a debate example in the first place. But I want to explain the virality of social media works. People want controversy. People want people to fail. People want Zomato CEO to get backlash because obviously people hate people who are richer than them. But also, when Zomato backlashes, who benefits? Their competitor Swiggy, which also delivers the same thing. Which means that at a point when Rapido is when Uber was facing a lot of backlash in India, that you're not paying our consumers enough at any point in time, was at a point when other companies like Rapido were able to come in and market this as their selling point. That we'll be nicer to our workers at any point in time. Which means that the unique selling point of safety can still exist. Because presumably, this is empirically true, that recently Zepto sales have gone down precisely because Zepto was trying to make it accessible and cheaper to people by cutting down delivery costs, by making it extremely unsafe, which is precisely why Zepto strikers went on strike. And for every day, for a couple of weeks, etc., every time I opened Zepto, it just said that sorry, we cannot deliver to you right now. What did I do then? I opted for the other delivery app, which means that the consumer base over the period of a week shifted to the other app, which was why Zepto was forced to become better. We think that there is a minimum baseline of safety regulation that has to be maintained anyway, but we think that companies compete over who can provide better safety standards. This is how they become safer. Four responses to safety. First, I already told you how call-outs work, but we already tell you how lawsuits can also happen, which means that it does not matter if even one publicized case of death happens, because we tell you that people have independent incentives to take up these cases, because you become a very famous lawyer at a point when you go against a very big company, which is that people oftentimes have these incentives to go and do that. But also governments like in developing economies also offer things like public interest litigation and stuff like that, which means governments offer you like public advocates, even if you cannot afford these lawyers at any point in time. Secondly, people have self-preservation incentives to do that. Obviously, I don't want to die because I want to live for my family. I want to give them money. I want to continue to earn more and more. So it doesn't matter if I cannot reach a place in 1 minute because I want to continue to live again so that I can also deliver further in the future. It does not matter if one consumer gives me 4-star rating if I can again deliver. The third is just to say that the comparative of informal sector will be much worse. I'll prove this later. Fourth is just to say that this is counterproductive for companies. Obviously, if your drivers are dying every day and getting into like accidents every day, obviously there are insurance coverages that exist. If you go on Rapido, it obviously oftentimes charges you very minimal amounts. So for example, when you book a train ticket, it charges you 0.0045 rupees, which adds to your insurance. Which means that companies obviously always charge for things like insurance. So in case that you meet up with an accident, they go ahead and pay this to you at any percent time. On informal sector, and why this is worse, and they cannot symmetricize jobs. First, on political will. If this was true, then there wouldn't be an unemployment crisis. Which is that even if there is incentive to provide jobs, oftentimes the nature of job is just independent of government. So automation happens, private companies enter, people leave the country. These are all things that the government cannot control. If the government cannot control this, it is immaterial whether the government has incentives to fix this. Secondly, they say that demand exists, which is why Zepto will happen in these cities anyway. But this is where they confuse our case. We tell you that this demand of this gig economy is artificially created. The reason why these companies are able to scale and expand into other cities is because they're able to sell at cheap prices. Obviously, people would prefer to go to their grocery shops if it is much more expensive to buy things online, which means that the reason why people end up opting into such applications was precisely because of their convenience and because of their accessible nature. Which means that the only way that these companies can expand and scale if they're much cheaper, if they offer prices at a cheaper rate, and this can only happen if they have a profit margin to go ahead and subsidize these costs and they have future investors. So they cannot just say that just because this demand exists. But even if this demand exists, that does not mean that these companies can scale up, because we tell you that they lack the capacity in terms of foreign investment at any point in time. 8 responses on informal sector. 1, you lose access to external visibility, which they claim to be extremely important. Which means that you're working in a random factory in some local city or some local village. It's just unclear why you have the same visibility that you would have if you were wearing a Zepto jacket and traveling everywhere within a big city at any point in time. Second is just to say that this visibility also often transcends to social media. It's unclear why social media will care about millions of factories that exist worldwide, but will obviously care about 2 or 3 companies that go ahead and market these millions of workers. Second is just to say that you have less informal support within your own company. So if there is a factory and there are only 10 or 100 workers, it's just unclear why you're able to get so much support within those 100 workers, as opposed to the millions of workers that work for like Zepto, Blinkit and Ayushman. I'm not saying that you'll be friends with all of these people, but we think that at a point when you go to warehouses to receive your order, you meet other people who also work in this warehouse and stuff like that. But also there's just like online connections that exist. Third, there is no alternative because oftentimes there are very limited factories. So if one factory is exploitative, obviously you cannot go out and go to some other place and go to some other factory, presumably because there's also population existing in that city which is also employed in that factory. Fourth, grassroots are very corrupt, which means that it is very easy to lobby local policemen that exist. You just have to give them 1,000 rupees as opposed to one person, which means that even if you go ahead and call this out, it's just unlikely why this translates into action. Fifth, automation is rapidly happening, which means that companies are more and more moving towards things like machine work, things like forklifts and stuff like that, which means that the amount of work that you can do as like a human being and physical labor is like extremely deteriorating. 6, the sort of physical work that you can then go ahead and do is extremely risky for your life, which means that you have to be in very close contact with things like carbon emission. You have to be in very close like contact with dealing with extremely hot stuff. This is precisely why people end up losing their hands on limbs at any point in time. This also deters their ability to earn future employment at any point in time, which means that even if it is slightly unsafe, that you might meet up in a road accident, which we prove to you is unlikely because people want to live again and again, and obviously 10 minutes, like covering 10 minutes in 1 kilometer is not that difficult, but also because consumers don't feel the same amount of time. So I ordered something on Blinkit, but then I went back to scrolling in Instagram, and then I didn't even realize that 10 or 15 minutes passed, and then I received a call that sir, your order is here. We think that consumers don't feel the extent of time that they claim, and consumers probably don't go ahead and backlash this as much, but also because these consumers are not rich assholes, and most times they're just normal students like you and I, and probably have much more empathy than they go ahead and claim. The last thing is just to say that obviously the wages in these companies are extremely less. They say that you have fuel costs and stuff like that, but I would like to posit that a lot of these times we think that this sort of money that you go ahead and earn from these companies is just a lot better, which means that maybe you earn 30 rupees for a 1 kilometer delivery. Even if there are fuel costs, we think it's extremely marginal, or even if it's like 10 or 50 rupees, we think that 15 rupees one delivery, and if you just go ahead and do like 30-40 deliveries, that's just a lot of money. The reason why we're in this debate is extremely simple. One, they already concede that you don't have a lot of companies, which means that from their side, they say that market share will shift to other companies, but this does not believe that not for two reasons. One, investors are pulling out, which is why these companies fail. So this market share won't go to other people because these investors are pulling out, they're not shifting to other places. Second is just to say that people end up losing faith in investor culture precisely because we see these companies failing at 10% time. But it's something that we should shut this debate on, because they concede that the extent of increase of wage will not be that high. So earning 100 rupees versus earning 120 rupees is not that much. But a person who's earning 0 rupees, for him to earn 100 more rupees is way better. It allows them to at least buy some food. So maybe one person buys lesser quality of food, but at least more people on scale just access better quality. This is the most important thing we should shut this debate on.
These workers are in so worst condition, they are dying out and right, and we have to help them, blah blah blah. We give you a significant amount of more reason that by the external incentive that forces companies to not do the things which they are doing. Things like competition. Her said that you will attach, will like make deal with each other, but they don't understand that if there are two competitors and if you have more drivers, that means that you can make more deliveries, you can earn more money, you have more leverage than your competition. This is the reason why there's a race to give more basis, more better condition. But second is, we try to tell that this debate cannot be about minimum working condition that applies to everywhere. Like this is a different industry, like even in one particular industry, you cannot kill people, you cannot push them in a condition where they are bad and they have revenue in the first place. But last on unionization, we explained that if 5,000 drivers stop for 5 days, the company will suffer for months and years. Like it made, like DPM also analyzed how stock market function within this company and affect their leverage. But last time we explained is that this is not things like rent and other things. If this working condition of these factories are so bad, that means it also affects your consumers, it also affects safety of your own product. Like they do not have common sense to make this argument in the first place. They never had the balls to defend the case which they need to defend. That you need to increase wages of 200 million workers, like 2,000 workers for your startup. That is the debate they had to defend, that even if you do not have capacity, even if you have to borrow money and debt, you have to increase wages of these workers, which they never explained fully. The first thing we explained, that why it is that you likely not scale up. They say that you will do anything. This is what they don't understand. There is no infinite amount of money placed that you will have to do this. But second, incentive of increasing job development does not mean you have capacity. Obviously, government have an incentive to provide free education to all, free job to all, but there are so many unemployed people. They never put capacity. What we explain that these companies already run on 15 to 200 or 15-20 years of net loss. They have to satisfy their investors. So if you have to increase 200 million or 2 million workers' wages, that is when you don't do things like scale up, but maintain your company, like maintain the losses, satisfy your investors in the short term and not higher. Look, obviously your profit capacity is disciplined in the first place. But the second thing we explain, and they consider on monopoly, that obviously only 2 or 3 companies are likely to happen. And we flip this. It is worse. Because on their subhouse, when this monopoly develops, they only have to do minimum thing. They never have to increase the wages. But on our subhouse, when competition increases, regardless of government incentive, now companies have to compete for better conditions and better wages. It is on their subhouse that this company becomes so big in the economy that is a lobby government. They can do minimum thing possible by this quote-unquote regulation and escape all of this. On our subhouse, this is a lot better. But the second thing we explain, if these people, because these jobs are so bad, people are dying. The employment process which you need to ask, that it is so bad. If the money is so low, why these people are doing this in the first place? Obviously, you can do other jobs. The reason why they are doing this, there is no fucking option to do anything. They are literally unemployed people. They do not have job. Like factory others that are also not giving them job. This is the reason why they are doing job in the first place. That means that either they have to work in a very worst condition, they do not have same capacity and live in a worse condition. But studying on unemployed people. And this also flips the argument of reparations. Because I would know that you owe reparations to more vulnerable people. This is the reason that you have reservation and affirmative policies. So obviously the person who scored best in class, obviously you also have a reparation to provide them. But the reparation apply to person a lot more who have suffered in the past, who is more vulnerable, hence to provide a reservation. So obviously a person who does not have a job, obviously a person who is sitting at home, there will be a reparation to do a lot more to provide them some sort of job. It is on our side house, these jobs are playing. The second thing we want to do is just visualizing of scale. They are so doing dirty way, they no jobs will happen now. We explain that by the scale of jobs often them too much and faster on our side house. Hence you are able to develop a lot more money. If more money comes out in country, it takes down to other jobs as well. When I start, this is when an investor have confidence to even put money in risky investors or risky startup. That is when you hire more jobs. That is when the economy thrives on people. This is when the money comes for quote unquote fooling the representatives. When I vote for people who do not have jobs.
This team just does not have the concept of a comparative, because they want to run the harms of informalization, but then they also want to run the harms of what happens when there is a monopoly. Either there can be a monopoly in the industry which absorbs all the jobs that are given out by the companies that have failed, and it's like zero sum, or there is informalization and there is no company in the sector. We already have a bunch of reasons to explain why there will still be companies in the sector, because at least some companies think it's better to comply than to fail. It's better to comply than to have all my investors fucking pull out. Which is why at that point of time there will be 2 or 3 companies who think this is the rational choice to go ahead and stay within that sector and go ahead and comply with the rules and regulations and the demands, whatever demands the government is putting on us. Which means that these companies still exist within this sector. What do these companies do then? There are a bunch of reasons that Ayushman to explain. These companies have the capacity and the incentive to go ahead and absorb the demand that is left out by the companies who have failed. I would note that this is the simple principle of economic readjustment, which means that if someone fails, that demand is necessarily absorbed by other companies, because economy functions on the principle of equilibrium. Which means that because these consumers still want that sort of bread at their home in a convenient setting, this means that these consumers will still exist, which means that the riders that are left out will always get jobs in the 2 or 3 companies that stay back. The next clash that I identified in this debate is just in jobs. In their best case, I concede. We vouch for better wages in our side of the paradigm. Why is that comparative still better and still defensible? There are a bunch of reasons in my speech to weigh out why these are the most vulnerable stakeholders within this debate. There just is not any response on their side to beat this claim of vulnerability of these particular stakeholders. They want to claim that, oh, we'll create new jobs, but there is literally no delta on new jobs, because expansion is a result of you having excess demand, and that excess demand will exist on either side, either ways. So on our side also, the companies that stay back will be able to capture this excess demand, which means at best their claim on new jobs is zero sum. Then the claim remains is that you have some jobs, you have more jobs that are happening which have low wages, and you have relatively less jobs but they have better wages. Why is better wages still good? We think a bunch of reasons here. First, it's just intuitively think. These are people who are earning the lowest possible wage that you can earn after working 13 hours a day. Where do they get the capacity to upskill? Probably on our side, when they have a little bit more disposable income, when they can devote that little bit more disposable income to get out of this vicious cycle of working continuously in an environment that is sucking the soul out of them. We think on our side, you upskill the fuck out of yourself and you get out of this vicious system which constantly just wants to exploit you. This ways why even on our side, if we have better wages for some people, it's okay, because at least you can escape the system. We've already weighed out how monopoly is the most likely comparative, and how in that case new jobs don't come up and the existing jobs don't go away. The last thing that I want to deal with is just why is there a need to do this? Because they want to beat the need to do this by saying that, oh, workers will protest. Look me in the eye and tell me what is the protest that you have seen be successful in terms of Blinkit delivery riders or Zepto riders. There is literally no example that they can come up with and give. There is literally no example of an MP in the parliament going. There is literally no example that they give except this MP in the parliament who spoke about it for a day and then moved on the next topic, because that's his playbook to get visibility. What I'm able to prove at the end of my speech is that there is necessarily a need to do this, because the protests are not enough, because the success rate of these protests is just not proven on their side, and we can just claim that it just doesn't happen. But we give you a bunch of reasons why these people are vulnerable and there's a need to do this, because other people don't care about them enough, because they have more proximate needs. So in most developing countries, you have needs like your own unemployment, or things like your like caste issues or gender issues or issues related to that, which the parties actually buy your votes on. But secondly, these people can't unionize, which means there's need for this. But thirdly, these people are uneducated and they're working in the worst of jobs, which means necessarily the state needs to do this. The state needs to fulfill